In nomine Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. This series of videos is going to be about the introduction to a devout life by St. Francis de Sales. And the reason being is that I came across this book recently and have found it to be incredibly useful and insightful. Now, the first thing that came to mind was the question of whether dealing with this material and speaking about it is appropriate for the laity, because ultimately it's all about spiritual instruction and learning to live the proper spiritual life. And so I took that question to my priest and I asked him how appropriate it is. And he assured me that thinking and trying to improve in the spiritual life is something that the laity really can and should discuss. At the end of the day, we're all in this together. We're all trying to serve the will of God in communion and in connection with one another. And ultimately, we are trying to help each other do that as much as possible. And so what I would like to do is just unpack and present a lot of the wisdom that's in this book, and just share some reflections on why it was so interesting in so many different ways. But at the same time, I would like to emphasize that I am not a spiritual teacher. It's one thing to convey and discuss these things, but the spiritual teaching itself, I still believe, is mostly the vocation of a priest. That's his station. And so if people are looking for general and genuine spiritual instruction, my main recommendation is to do exactly that. Go and find a good priest and have him guide you through your development. Now, of course, I'm a sedevacantist, which means that I actually think there are relatively few decent priests left available to us. But they do exist, and there are still relatively few, but many. And the best way to find them is to use this thing called the Lux Vera directory. I will leave a link in the description. But if you type in Lux-Vera, V-E-R-A, there should be directories for both America and the rest of the world. And they give you details of all of the institutions and priests who have explicitly rejected the legacy of Vatican II and its teaching. And so you'll be able to find phone numbers, email addresses, all that kind of stuff of priests who you should be able to speak to. In my experience, they're all happy to speak to you no matter what country you're from. So even if there's one not near to you, they'll probably be happy to speak to you over the phone or by email. But at the same time, men are men and they're not perfect. So exercise a little bit of discretion and discernment as well. Fortunately, all of the ones I've met and dealt with have been wonderful, for lack of a better word. Human beings, very well-rounded, very wise, very prudent, very disciplined, and very honest. So hopefully you can find the same. But like I say, what I want to do with this series is just to convey the wisdom of St. Francis in what he's written, so that we can make use of that. But then your spiritual instruction really should be done by the professionals. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into what he had to say. So, as an overview of the book, why it's so interesting is because it's, like I say, it's an introduction to the devout life, right, to the life of devotion. And as we'll come to learn, that is nothing less than devoting your entire life to God. That's what you should do. That's really what we're here for in our entirety. And so it's all about living the best life that you can. But again, it's by focusing on the spiritual side of it. And what makes the book so interesting is that, first of all, it's accessible. Secondly, it's accessible to everyone. And what I mean by that is that he hasn't written this book just to instruct priests or deacons or bishops or nuns. He's written it for every person in every station of life, including the religious, but also people who are parents and carpenters and whatever else. It's a general overall guide, and therefore it serves as a really good introduction that everyone can learn from to some degree. And because it's an introduction as well, he's made sure that he's included everything which is essential, which is the most important, which is of most use to everyone, to really help us as much as possible as we're breaking into the spiritual life of Catholicism. As a little introduction to St. Francis himself, I believe, sorry if I've got the date wrong, that he was born in the 1500s. He was born in De Sales in, I think it's in France, but it might be in Geneva, because I know he went and became active in Geneva later on. But he studied, he became very proficient at both canon and civil law. And then he was later, he later became a bishop as well. He founded his own religious order, and he also converted thousands of people to the faith. And he was particularly involved in fighting against the heresies and confusions of Calvinism. So that's a bit of his legacy. I think he is known as the Saint of Love, and I also know that he is the patron saint of writers. Of course, it will go without saying that all of the saints are pretty amazing and impressive people, but you know, each time you go through it, you wonder how individuals can achieve so much. That's Francis. That is Saint Francis de Sales. And he wrote this book, of course, as an instruction for people in general. Not only did he convert many people to the faith, but as a bishop, as a religious teacher, he instructed many people in the best way to live their good Catholic lives. Now, just a very last thing to mention about the book is that it's written as if it's a letter, a very long letter to someone who's interested in becoming devout. And with that in mind, he frames that in his imagination around this character who he calls Philothea. And Philothea is simply his model of not a perfect woman, but perfect in the sense that she has the perfect intention for becoming devout. And so the assumption is that she's reading this and she absolutely wants to become devout. She hasn't perfected that yet. So he's giving her as much instruction as he can. So that's why sometimes you might hear me use the name Philothea, but that's all it means. It's this fictional ideal character who he's speaking to with this book, instructing her in the best way to become devout. So without further ado, let's get into some of the things he has to say. So to begin with, he starts off by saying that it is necessary before all things that you should know what the virtue of devotion is. For since there is but one true devotion, and very many which are false and vain. And then he goes on to say, each one paints devotion according to his own passion and fancy. He that is given to fasting holds himself for very devout, if he do but fast, though his heart be full of rancour. And though he dare not moisten his tongue in wine or even in water for fear of transgressing sobriety, yet he scruples not to plunge it in the blood of his neighbour by detraction and calumny. So basically what he's saying is that there are people who have got devout practices who, for all external appearances, might seem like they're very devout people, right? So you might imagine this character who fasts all the time, right? Apparently they might be fasting on a daily or weekly basis to the point where everyone else is astonished by how much effort and will they put into it. They must think this person is so pious. But what he's saying is that, look, don't be fooled. If this person does these devout things, these acts of devotion, but they then go from that and are not actually living as a true Christian, right, as a true Catholic, and they, steal or commit sin or insult and do injustice to their neighbour, then all of that devotion is just appearance. Indeed, it might just be something that the person enjoys. Maybe the person really enjoys fasting and then can use that as a way of giving the appearance, not just to others, but even to themselves. It's probably the most important bit. They can fool themselves into thinking they're being very devout, when in fact the real sign of a life of devotion is actually living by and becoming virtuous. And so that is what you need to keep in mind. And so that's why he calls it the virtue of devotion, right? That is what we're trying to get out of it. The spiritual development is a moral development. I think that's probably one of the anchor points to understanding what the spiritual life is about. We're trying to shape and grow and develop our moral character. Many characters cover themselves with certain external actions belonging to holy devotion, and the world believes them to be truly devout and spiritual, whereas in reality they are but statues and phantoms of devotion. So he goes on to talk about what true devotion therefore is. True and living devotion, O Philothea, presupposes the love of God. Nay, rather, it is no other thing than a true love of God. And this is a theme that I've seen recurring. In a sense, Catholicism and the spiritual life are enormous, with great deals of depth and complexity. And, we're having to contemplate and live in the will of the infinite and almighty God. But at the same time, it actually slices down simply to one dimension. Loving God is all there is to it. But straight off the bat, one of the things I want to emphasize, and one of the things that's helped me gain a lot of clarity in terms of what that involves, is understanding really what love is. And it's quite interesting. The reason why it's so important for us English speakers is because the word love in the English language is profoundly limited, right? You can say that you love a good film in the same way that you love your child or your wife, right? But obviously the quality of that love is completely different. You might as well be talking about two different things. And so indeed, there are people who do talk about different things, and my favourites for this have been the ancient Greeks. C.S. Lewis is quite good on this. He's written a book called The Four Loves, and that goes into a lot of detail. But the main one I want to focus on is the word agape. So let me backtrack a second. There are four types of love according to the ancient Greeks: storge, eros, philios, and agape. And the idea is one is affection or familiarity. Then you've got romantic love, friendship, and then finally agape, which is divine love. Okay, so that's what we're focusing in on. Now, what's interesting about that is that the word agape is the word for love used in the New Testament. Okay, so as you know, the writers of the New Testament were writing in Greek, trying to speak to the Greeks, and the word they used for love was not storge or eros or philios, but it was agape. So if you read the New Testament in Greek, you will find that Jesus implores the apostles to agape thy neighbor, right? And to agape the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul. Why is that important? Well, because the word agape doesn't mean that you like something, all right? And that's the real distinction you want to make between the biblical understanding of love and our vernacular, weak understanding of it in English. We use love in English to say that we like something very much, or we have a connection to it, right? Like I like a bit of cake, or I love my wife, but that just means I really, really like her. The meaning that we actually want to convey, and that we sometimes do imply in English, is this idea that no, you love things even if you don't necessarily like them or feel affection for them. What it really is conveying is that you want what is best for someone, okay? Now, you can feel different kinds of love for someone at the same time, right? So you can feel eros for someone and agape, philios and storge. So these things aren't exclusive, but Christ has told us to focus on agape. He's told us to focus on wanting what is best for someone, doing, willing, intending, and acting towards their good, because it is good for them, right? Not because it's good for us, not because it makes us feel happy, not because we enjoy it, but because it's good for them. And if we happen to enjoy it, hey, that's a bonus, okay? So let's tie this back to what we're talking about. there's only one dimension to the spiritual life, to becoming a good Catholic, to being a good human being, to love God. But what does that mean? Well, it means to have agape for God. It means to want what is best for God, okay? And if we want and we will and we intend what is best for God and we act towards that, in a nutshell, that is the entirety of our spiritual lives, right? That is the entirety of our moral lives. And we can see how that follows, right? Because at the end of the day, we're supposed to give our love, our life, and our attention to Him for His sake, for His goodness, because He is goodness itself. And we're to reject pride, we're to reject the idea of taking that and strangling that for ourselves. And so that's what it entails. And then, of course, what that also entails is that because God so loves us and loves everything that He's created, He wants us to love our neighbour as well, yeah, to want what is best for our neighbours for their own sake. And actually it's because it's for God's sake as well. So these things all tie and fold in together. So St. Francis says that the life of devotion is nothing less than the love of God. And then we can see how that follows. If to love something means to want and intend and will what is best for it, then he says that the life of devotion, the true life of devotion, is nothing less than wanting, willing, and intending what is best for God. The other thing I should have mentioned, because now St. Francis goes on to say, insofar as it gives us strength to do good, devotion is called charity. But when it reaches such a degree of perfection that it makes us not only do good, but to do so carefully. I've misread the quote. We are helped along in devotion by grace. That's what God gives us that's the fuel, if we like. God gives us the fuel of devotion, which is grace, and then we light the fire of that fuel with our will, with our action, by acting and developing it. And so, insofar as grace gives us strength to do good, it is called charity. And the interesting thing there is that we're told that charity is the king of all virtues in Christianity, in Catholicism. The same word for charity, the same derivative that comes from, is the word agape. They're all the same thing. So just keep that in mind as well. When we're told to have charity, and that charity is the greatest virtue, we're actually being told that agape, love, that divine love, is our greatest virtue. And that's interesting to pick up because sometimes we have a very thin slice of what charity means. We only really use it in English to talk about, giving someone something when they're in need, or perhaps, giving a poor person money. It's actually far more expansive than that. Charity in the Catholic sense is willing, intending what is best for someone. But you can see that St. Francis is kind of maturing that. He's saying that when grace gives us the strength to do good, it is called charity. But when it reaches such a degree of perfection that it makes us not only do good, but do it carefully, frequently, and readily, then it is called devotion, right? So devotion is taking the virtue of agape, of divine love, and once it becomes natural and we're doing it with our full intention and care, that's when we have said we've achieved devotion, right? It's simply taking that love that we're called upon to have and taking it to its conclusion. Okay, so this passage is interesting because it's all about how when we begin a life of devotion, we have to do it in stages, all right? So let me just read this passage for you. For just as a man, but newly recovered from some sickness, walks only so much as is needful, and but slowly and heavily, in like manner, the sinner, when newly healed of his iniquity, walks in so far as God commands him, but heavily and slowly, until he attains to devotion. For then, like a man in sound health, he not only walks, but runs and leaps in the way of God's commandments. And that's in some senses very pertinent and also a bit of a relief as well. If you're like me, or perhaps even not, I was going to say, if you're like me and you're new to the life of Catholicism, it can seem very overwhelming because we're called upon to do nothing less than be perfect like God is. And you see the example of the saints or even other people who are just in the church and you think there's such a long way to go. And it seems so difficult as well. That's such a hill to climb. What St. Francis is saying is that, yeah, but that's like you've just been sick. You know, you've been in bed with a fever for the last 20 or 30 years and you've suddenly gotten out of bed. Now, when you get out of bed, are you going to just get up and run and lift weights and do gymnastics? Like, well, no, of course not. You get out of bed first, and if you like, that's our call to grace. That's what happens at baptism. And then after we're out of bed, that's when we slowly get to our feet, build ourselves up, gain our strength, and we gradually start walking. But that's what's being expected of us. That's what St. Francis says that he expects of the process, right? The sinner finds that when they start, they feel very encumbered by the whole process. But again, devotion is like our moral training. And when we become strong in that, we will find that we're actually able to do this stuff very readily. But it's going to take time, right? Going back to the thing we said just before that, he says, charity and devotion differ no more than one from the other, than flame from the fire, right? So as we've already said, charity, being agape, being divine love, is no different from devotion. Just like the flame and the fire are one and the same thing. Charity, love, agape are the flame of devotion. Devotion is simply when that flame is shining at its brightest. This is an interesting passage. St. Francis is talking about the challenge that the world gives to us when it comes to being devout. So he says, the world sees that devout persons fast, that they pray, that they bear injuries patiently, that they serve the sick, give to the poor, watch, bridle their anger, repress and stifle their passions, deprive themselves of sensual pleasures, and do such actions and other kinds of actions which, in themselves, are hard and rigorous. But the world does not see the interior and cordial devotion which renders all of these actions agreeable, sweet, and easy. Okay? That's the idea. When we mature in our devotion, we don't just become good, but we find it easy to be good. And being good, really, in the world is quite painful, very hard. It requires a lot of devotion, time, patience, a lot of sacrifice. And so, for all exterior appearances, it looks like we're having a hard and painful time if we're able to become devout. What he's saying is that this is just an illusion to the eyes of the world. Devout people are actually really peaceful and joyful inside. I mean, you'll find that in the Testament of the Saints. So many saints had very, very hard lives. But you get this consistent impression that they all had a blast while they were living them, right? My favourite story is the one of Saint Lawrence, who was in Rome, and they literally roasted him alive on an open fire as if he was a spit roast, right? So they slowly rotated him while he was roasting over an open flame. And while they were roasting him, he was cracking jokes at them, like, I'm not quite done yet, you can keep me going, I'll be crispy in a minute, then I'll be tasty. And you think, what level of interior peace must you need to crack jokes at someone while they're burning you alive, right? And so you can see St. Francis kind of implying that with that passage, that as much as the world might see the life of devotion as something that's going to be really horrible, actually there's something hidden there which is far more enjoyable than you might otherwise think. Okay, so here's a very key point that I want everyone to emphasize. Devotion is suited to all vocations and professions. In the creation, God commanded the plants to bring forth their fruit, each fruit to its own kind. Even so, he commands Christians, who are the living plants of his church, to bring forth fruits of devotion, each one according to his kind of vocation. So, yeah, it's like the church is God's garden, right? And as we all know, a garden with the same type of flower all the way through is quite dull and uninteresting. And that's obviously like a trivial way of framing it, I suppose. But you can see what St. Francis is saying. There are many flowers in the garden which all come together to give it that symphony of beauty. And just like there are so many different flowers, there are so many different types and purposes that each person can have, right? We're not monochromatic. And so he's saying that, well, God has fashioned us in this way so that each one can bear forth the thing which is proper for him to give. He intends for there to be a multiplicity of vocations and duties and actions within society. Of course, right, we couldn't have society with only one type of vocation. And so because of that, we have to understand that devotion, because it is the calling of every single person, is suitable and suited to every single type of duty, station and being, okay? Whether you're a police officer, a postman, a milkman, a mother, a teacher, a nurse, a soldier, a king, a bishop, or a deacon, all of us can be devout. We can all factor that into our lives and make that a part, and make it a part of it. It's a really strong thing to emphasize, important thing to emphasize, because I think that, you know, I definitely had it coming into Catholicism thinking that the spiritual life is mostly emphasized for the religious. And in a sense it is, they definitely give much more of their attention to it, but it's not relegated to them. It is something that we are all called upon to be a part of. All Catholics, no matter what they're doing, should engage with the spiritual life and should engage with devotion. The practice of devotion must be accommodated to the strength, to the affairs, and to the duties of each one individually, right? So it's the same fabric, but it must be worn differently, slightly differently by each person, right? It's the same goal, it's the same pursuit. Ultimately, it's the same thing, but it's being adapted and suited slightly differently depending on what vocation you have. We must all be devout, we must all be loving and have a life of devotion, but exactly what that's going to look like is going to be slightly different, and it's going to be slightly, the appropriateness of devotion is going to be different for each person, right? Let me continue. Devotion, when it is true, never spoils anything, but rather perfects all things. And when it becomes inconsistent with the lawful vocation of anyone, it is without doubt false. And that makes perfect sense, right? Well, it follows, because if devotion is the purest thing that God is calling us to do, then it must make everything better. Why would he call on us to do something that would make anything worse in any objective sense? And so the idea is that, I mean, very, very faintly, it's again like that idea of adding salt to things. Salt is a ingredient which can be given to any meal, yeah? So no matter what dish you add it to, it enhances and brings out its flavor. Even though the dishes themselves probably shouldn't be mixed together, right? You can add salt to an Indian curry as well as you can actually add it to hot chocolate. but you wouldn't put a hot chocolate in a curry, right? That would be insane. Nevertheless, if you take that and you add it to each of those dishes, then it does actually enhance them. So you have this one common thing that is good for all these other things, which still allows them to be their own individual thing, right? And allows them to bring out their potential in its fullness. And so that's what the life of devotion is supposed to do for us. So now he emphasizes this by going on to pointing out how there were so many different saints and so many different vocations, right? Saint Joseph, Lydia, and Saint Crispin were perfectly devout in their workshops. Saint Anne, Saint Martha, Saint Monica, Aquila, and Priscilla in their households. Cornelius, Saint Sebastian, Saint Maurice in the army. Constantine, Helen, Saint Louis, Blessed Amadeus, and Saint Edward on their thrones. It has even happened that many have lost perfection in solitude, which, notwithstanding, is so favourable to perfection, and have persevered and have preserved it amidst the multitude, which seems so little favourable to perfection. I messed up that last bit a little bit, but basically what he's saying is that, look, you have these saints who they were working in workshops, in households, in the army, they were kings and queens and all that kind of stuff, so a big broad range of vocations. And then obviously it goes without saying that many saints were bishops and priests and nuns and deacons and that kind of thing. But what he said at the end there was that there are actually many cases in which sainthood has been defiled, devotion has been defiled by people living a life that wasn't suitable for them, right? So for example, you couldn't have a king that lives like a monk. It's not suitable for his station. He needs to be a public figure. He needs to be involved in the world, and he can't live as a recluse or as a hermit would, because then he wouldn't be acting as a good king. Ultimately, for us to be the flowers that God has planted us to be, and to bear the fruit that he wants us to bear, we must do the jobs that we have been given by him. And so if God has created you to become a king, and then you become a hermit, well, you've not borne the fruit that he intended you to bear, right? And so that is what he's saying. Again, there's no need to be binary and say, well, therefore it's bad to be a monk or bad to be a king. It's like, no, it's good for a king to be a king. It's good for a monk to be a monk. And it's good for a king to give the life of devotion to his kingly life, whereas it's very good for a monk to give the life of devotion to his life as a monk. Okay, so this passage goes back to something that I said at the start of the video. Do you wish in good earnest to set out on the way of devotion? Seek out some good man to guide and conduct you. This is the admonition of admonitions, which means he's saying it's the he couldn't ask you any more strongly, right? If there was one thing that he could really emphasize for you to do, it's this: find a good spiritual teacher on the life of devotion. I don't really know how much else to get into when it comes to what that entails, right? Basically, find a good priest. There's no other way of putting it. Someone who is well versed in the faith, who has your best interest at heart, and who's going to guide you. And I think Francis gives one more bit of advice on that, which I think just summarizes the main points very succinctly. Choose one among 1,000, says, well, he's now quoting St. Teresa of Avila. And I say among 10,000, for there are fewer than can be imagined who are fitted for this office. He must be full of charity, of knowledge, and of prudence. If one of these three qualities be wanting in him, there is danger. But I say to you once more, pray to God to give you such a one. So there's really nothing else you could say on top of that, right? The only thing I would just tangentially say is that, he said these men are 1 in 1,000. That may well be true. And like I said, I would recommend a Sedi Vacantis priest. And there probably aren't even thousands of them. But the first thing I would say is that all the ones I've come across are 1 in 1,000. And for numerous reasons, they're 1 in 1,000 to have made that decision and be in that position in the first place. What I think the most useful bit of advice, well, no, I'll go back on that in a sec. But he points out, find someone who is full of charity, knowledge, and prudence. Basically, they're loving and kind, they're wise and learned, and they're hardworking and disciplined as well. And that's a really important factor too. Fortunately, I've only met a handful of priests, of genuine Catholic priests, and they are all those 3 things to a man. And so I've got confidence that if you go and seek them out, you'll be in luck before you know it. But the last thing then to emphasize is that if you're despairing of that being the case and you're worried about that not happening, then of course, pray to God to let you find someone like that, and He will provide. This is interesting. What are the flowers of our hearts, O Father Thea, but good desires? As soon as they appear, we must put our hand to the pruning knife to cut away from our conscience all dead and superfluous works. So St. Francis is using this really nice recurring metaphor of being a garden, being a flower, being a plant, and that the life of devotion, that spiritual goodness within us is a plant that we're growing and cultivating. So he's saying that our good desires are those kinds of flowers, right? If they come into bloom, that shows that our heart is giving out what it should do. Sorry about that, my camera just decided to stop recording. Okay, so the flowers of our hearts are good desires. And then he talks about pruning away the superfluous works, right? So we're allowing our desires to do good to bloom up within us, and we should keep those. We should allow them to have as much room to flourish as possible. But the weeds and the thorns within our souls, within our hearts, are the things that we need to take care and attention to strip away. The soul who aspires to the honour of becoming a spouse of the Son of God must put off the old man and put on the new. And that may well be the most difficult passage that I've come across in this, because especially if we've been living sinful lives for a long time, I mean, we're always going to we don't ever stop on the path to perfection. But our old selves really aren't good enough, right? Our old inclinations and desires and habits and you name it, even a lot of our old activities and associations and friends and that kind of thing are not appropriate, are not going to cut it for the life of devotion and perfection. And so we have to be willing to get rid of all of it. Any of it which is bad, right? Which may well be the vast majority. Doesn't matter. It could be all of it. But the point is that we have to be willing to get rid of whatever we're used to, accustomed to, comfortable with, to become who we need to be. And so it's hard, right? If you spent so many years acclimatizing yourself, adapting yourself, getting used to a sinful life and all of its comforts and its habits, you train them into yourself, they become part of you. And then they might even feel very familiar. They're like your comfort zone in many ways. They might be the thing they might be the parts of your life that you enjoy the most. Still, you have to get rid of them. You have to be willing to burn them off and let them go. And that's something that you have to just accept as you stand on the threshold of the Catholic life. The ordinary purgation and healing, whether of the body or soul, is only brought about little by little, by progressing from improvement to improvement, with effort and by slow progress. By the way, purgation simply means purification. Okay, so we talk about purgatory as the place where purification will happen. Not where it will start, but where any leftover purification needs to take place, right? So that's purgatory. But the saints and old writers do use the word purgation more generally, and that just means the process of purification. So the ordinary purgation and healing happens step by step, and it's a gradual progress of improvement. The soul that ascends from sin to devotion is likened to the dawn, which, when it comes, does not dispel the darkness in an instant, but little by little. I find that quite encouraging as well. It goes back to what I was saying earlier on about the idea of, when we were talking about the idea of the man being sick, and you can't just get out of a bed after a sickness and leap over a river. So he's expanding on that, and he's giving this really beautiful picture of a sun slowly rising and slowly, gradually breaking away the darkness that is covering it. And so that's how we've got to think of our own spiritual development. It's a relief because if you are looking to become devout, any of us are going to sin and carry on sinning and progress and fall and discover new and deeper faults that we've got that we're going to have to uncover. And there's always going to be an element of darkness there. And the fact is, there's going to seem like a lot of it, and there's going to seem like there's a lot of darkness to uncover. But what he's saying is that don't worry about that. At the beginning of the dawn, there is basically nothing but darkness, but that light comes in slowly and gradually. But eventually, as the sun rises, it becomes something that dispels all darkness until you have nothing but the day. And so we should take it in that image, right? We are willing to be patient and work with ourselves while that sun slowly rises. The exercise of the purgation of the soul cannot, nor indeed ought it come to an end until we die. Let us not, therefore, be troubled because of our imperfections, for our perfections consist in fighting against them, and we cannot fight against them if we do not see them, nor conquer them if we do not encounter them. Our victory does not lie in not feeling them, but in not consenting to them. And to be harassed by them is not the same thing as to consent to them. Indeed, in order that we may be exercised in humility, it is necessary for us to be sometimes wounded in this spiritual battle. But we are never overcome except when we have lost either life or courage. So, again, it just ties back into everything that's just been said. There is always going to be darkness there. And indeed, as we know, shining a light sometimes reveals shadows that we didn't otherwise see. So as we're going through this development, there may well be many times when we uncover new horrors about ourselves that we need to overcome. But he's saying again that we don't have to take that as a sign of defeat. The only defeat comes in giving way to those sins. If you experience a temptation, then that reveals two things. First of all, that you're tempted, and secondly, that you still have some kind of affection or desire to do something evil. And he's saying that, yes, but that's not the real problem. So long as you're willing to fight against it, that's all just part of the process of overcoming that. The only evil comes from consenting to it, to doing the sin itself. But even then, that's not the end of the story. If you do consent, you can still use the fact that you've realized you've sinned to redouble your efforts and get yourself back up and re-enter the fight. Okay? And we continually and will progressively have that chance and that battle to fight, which is why he says the process never comes to an end, not indeed until we die. And again, if purgatory exists, possibly not until sometime after that as well. Imperfections and venial sins cannot take away the life of grace, for that can only be lost by mortal sin. That's an important thing to emphasize. Try and avoid mortal sin at all cost, right? Do not mortally sin. It's not the end of the story, because we can go to confession and we can be absolved of mortal sin, thank God. But they are in a different class of sin from venial sins and imperfections. We'll talk a bit more about what those are later. But yeah, if there was like a quick and easy rule for like Catholic Life 101, you could probably say avoid mortal sin, like as a start. If you wanted just to get the very, very simplest thing to do, if you're trying to live the spiritual life, I think that might be a good candidate for a rule. Just try and avoid mortal sin. This is an awesome quote. It is a happy condition for us in this warfare that we shall always be victorious, provided that we are willing to fight. The job is not to become perfect, as we said, right? The job is to be willing to keep trying. God knows how flawed we are. And the more we develop, the more we'll come to understand that as well. We are incredibly flawed and distorted creatures with very, very corrupted wills, thoughts, and intentions. And so even as we make progress, we're going to cycle back on ourselves and fall into all kinds of errors, many that we can see and many that we don't. So there's going to be a lot of dirt to clean off by the time, God willing, that we'll be able to walk into heaven. But that doesn't matter, because God is so just and merciful. The only thing that he really cares about, the main thing that he cares about, is for us to be willing to do our part and to keep fighting and to keep putting our effort in. And if we keep doing that, he will continue to be willing to give us the perfection that we ask for. As we keep rolling around in the mud, so long as we're willing to go back to him and ask for a shower, he will spray us off, okay? The only time that we're really defeated is if we fall into the mud and are so despairing that we choose to stay there. That's the one thing that we should not and cannot do. If we don't do that, we're going to have the rest of our lives and that many chances to keep on fighting. So as I think I'm getting close to an hour, I'm going to end that video there, but I'll continue more in the future as we keep going through this wonderful book. I hope that's been of interest. Thank you very much for your time.